But today, we're 2.5 weeks away from Passover and unleavened bread. And so I thought I would do something that was biblical and scriptural, but something also that gathers some information on a topic that was a much bigger topic back when United began and worldwide breakup occurred in 1995, and it has to do with the Hebrew calendar. So the title of this Bible study is Hebrew Calendar Basics, and it is basic. We have a church, a Kagwa approved study paper that is 29 pages long. What I handed you is 2 pages long. So I've found some highlights and I've condensed down, but I did hours and hours and hours of reading. And the more I was into it, the more fascinating I became by it. But I don't want to get in the weeds with really technical stuff, so I kept it rather simple in terms of some of the basics of the Hebrew calendar. So when I'm narrating parts of what you have on your handout sheets, I'll point out to you, this is what your handout is saying, and then of course I've got other commentary in addition. So starting with your handout, it says, did ancient Israel use some kind of a calendar when leaving Egypt? And then I have 4 examples here. A, God said to Moses, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And that's Exodus 12, verse 2. So the hint is, coming away from Egypt, Moses and the Israelites had some knowledge of a calendar, something that they had lived with for 400 years in Egypt. And so here, God is speaking of the Hebrew month of Tishri. This is called the first month of the year. It's the sacred calendar, not the civil calendar. We'll talk about that momentarily. But Tishri is the first month on the Hebrew calendar, and it actually starts this March 21st, this coming Tuesday. It'll be the beginning of Tishri. And so that commandment alone requires that the Israelites had some kind of a calendar. Second example, based on the reference of days in a month, Noah, it says here, must have known of a calendar. Now, to back up just a tiny bit, we know that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He was involved with the writing of all the first 5 books of the Bible. So whether this was verbal tradition handed down, or Moses was inspired by God, or Noah actually had a calendar. We can't be positive, but it says, Genesis 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. That's pretty precise. I mean, we're all anxious to know, well, of the 2nd month, was it the same Hebrew calendar that Jesus Christ was using and that we understand today? We have some wiggle room in that. We don't know for sure. The next example, there was a calendar in place when the Jews came out of Babylon. This is when they started using Babylonian names for months. Now the first month, starting in a couple of days, on Tuesday, is Aviv in Hebrew, but it's Nisan in Babylonian. So you'll see either the Hebrew names or the Babylonian names. Ancient Israel started using the Babylonian names. We see this in Nehemiah 8, verse 2. Next example, there was more than one calendar in use during Jesus Christ's earthly ministry. Now, there's different scholars that discuss possibly differences in how the Sadducees and the Pharisees looked at the calendar. There is that, but also the Essenes, a small exclusive group that had a very obscure calendar that wasn't widespread, but they did use a different calendar than the rest of Judea at the time. There's no proof any of these were the same calendar over thousands of years, and there's no single calendar clearly defined in Scripture. But Scripture does confirm the existence of a calendar or calendars in different time periods. So you'll see my SPS here. It says, in this Bible study, I'd like to share some very basic aspects on how we determine God's annual holy days in our modern day, the Hebrew calendar basics. So how can we know which calendar was used when God revealed his annual Sabbaths or festivals? In Leviticus 23, God lists all of them, starting with the weekly Sabbath there. Well, the Bible does not give enough details on how to construct a festival calendar, but it does tell us when the festivals occur according to a calendar. There have been a lot of discussions, and people, back before 1995, a lot of people were starting to question our following of how we have chosen or decided to use the same thing that the Jews have kept, the oracles of God, and how they have kept very precise records, and that we said we're going to follow this is what Mr. Herbert Armstrong decided way back, long time ago, on how we would also recognize and keep God's holy days as well. Now, there have been efforts by some who claim to have figured out a more perfect way to create a calendar. There have been people that have argued, well, we really need to go back to observation of the new moons from month to month, but there are major problems with that, as we're going to see in a moment. The key thing is there has never been a perfect calendar in any society on earth. Never. All calendars need adjustments, because God did not give us a perfect calendar, and he didn't give us a calendar in the scriptures at all. There has been a theory that you cannot prove by the Bible, a theory that before the flood in Noah's day, there might have been a more perfect 360-day revolution around the sun of the earth, down to the microsecond maybe. And so thousands and thousands of years, you wouldn't have any adjustments or tweaking if that were the case. It's not. We have a calendar that goes 365.24 days in a solar year. Well, that introduces some error. Let's keep on reading, though. On our Gregorian calendar, this is in your notes, one day must be added every 4 years. We know this. It's called leap year. And the Gregorian calendar took the place of the Julian calendar back in the 1500s by this Gregory the 13th was Pope Gregory decided in Europe to change it because the Julian calendar was adding much more error, days of error, that was pushing all of the holidays like Easter earlier or later in the year. I can't remember which, but he made that decision. And the last ones to adopt it were England and the colonies here in the U.S. So it was like 1754 before there was a sudden switch over to adopt the Gregorian calendar, which is more accurate than the Julian calendar. Nobody uses the Julian calendar really. Well, I take that back. The Orthodox Greeks do in Europe. The Eastern Orthodox Church still uses a Julian calendar, and they have to make adjustments. So, long story short, every calendar on earth needs to have adjustments. So, what about this Gregorian calendar? It is strictly a solar calendar. It goes by the seasons, and it doesn't use the moon at all to determine anything. It just goes by the seasons. Once again, 365.24 days. What happens at the end of 100 years? You've got to skip a leap year every 100 years. What's more fun than that is that the Gregorian calendar, by the year 4000, you've got to skip an additional day because there's still that little error, something like 11 seconds a year. Like, we're really worried about that, right? Is that one of the heavy things on your mind right now? The year 4000? Oh, we're gonna have to skip another leap year day. I don't think so. We got much more on our minds than that. Another example here, the modern Muslim calendar has 354 or a 355-day year. It's 11 days short of a solar year every year. So it takes 33 years, and when you see on a modern calendar, Ramadan or some of the other holidays, I'll call them holy days for the sake of the Muslims, it's all over the page. It's all around the calendar. You can have Ramadan in January, by the end of 33 years, it's all the way around to December. And so it lines up every 33 years. So that's why that can be anywhere across the whole 12-month calendar. Another one, Chinese calendars. They add a leap month about every 3 years. On the Hebrew calendar, each month alternates 29 days, 30 days, 29 days, 30 days. A couple of exceptions. So it's 11 days short of a solar year as well. So they add a 13th month called an intercalary month, once every 3 years, or 7 times in a 19-year time cycle. So again, those are just examples of every calendar needs tweaking or adjustments. Thankfully, the Hebrew calendar, based on the Bible and the creation week, has stuck to a 7-day week, a 7-day week. Not all civilizations have done that. The Aztecs used a 13-day week. Ancient Rome had both a 7-day and an 8-day week, up until Emperor Constantine in 321 AD. He put a stop to that. It was going to be a 7-day week. People of Java, Javanese people, use a 5-day week. Ancient China uses a 10-day week. Pretty scary if you're trying to keep God's Sabbath and you have a 10-day week. But now this is something that we don't know, but in the future, when we know that the beast power will have the power to change times and seasons, that might be something enforced on the world. We don't know, some kind of a calendar change. We know there have been efforts in Europe to switch to a first day of the week being a Monday, not a Sunday, because of economics and because of industry. 1939, the Soviet Union tried a 5-day work week and then a 6-day work week, all because of commerce. They wanted to keep more factory workers in factories around the whole week. And they would alternate, different people would take off a day, but it was a 5-day week. But it made more problems than it solved. So 1 year later, 1940, they went back to what we know today. So people have experimented with the days of the week as well. Neither a purely solar calendar like the Gregorian calendar that we have with us today, nor a purely lunar calendar like the Muslims use, can determine holy days accurately. Neither one by itself. A solar calendar comes close to coinciding with the seasons, yes, the 4 seasons of the year, but it doesn't reflect the cycle of the moon, which is necessary in determining biblical months. But a purely lunar calendar doesn't even come close to coinciding with the seasons. So the seasons would be way off in a course of time if we only had a lunar calendar. Back to your notes again. The Hebrew calendar uses the sun to determine seasons, but also a particular new moon to determine the beginning of a sacred year. Let's read together Genesis 1, verses 14 through 16. It says, "Then God said, 'Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth.' And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also." Well, clearly he's talking about the sun, the brighter, more dominant light of the daytime, and the moon giving light at night. So here we have the 2 great lights, and the statement is clear. They are for the purpose of establishing seasons and for days and years. The Hebrew word moed, the plural is moedim, translated seasons, plural, is interesting in that it is never used for climactic climatic seasons, the climates, the 4 seasons of the year. It's never used in the Bible to determine summer, fall, winter, spring. It is used for the special use of appointed times, appointed seasons. In other words, Moedim speaks of holy days. Leviticus 23, verse 2. Here God uses the very same word, moed or moedim. He says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts, moedim, of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. These are God's moedim, God's feasts. In your notes, again, so the Hebrews have preserved a solar-lunar combination calendar that coincides with the 4 seasons of the year. It's calculated by both the movements of the sun and the cycles of the moon. So once again, a lunar-solar calendar is what we use for mapping out the holy days. It's calculated by both the movements of the sun and the cycles of the moon. And the early festivals of the year, starting this coming Passover, coincide with the beginning and the end of spring harvest. In the seasonal spring, Aviv will be the month in Hebrew. Nisan is the Babylonian term or name for the first month. And Aviv simply means the green ears or the new ears of barley. And so it has to coincide with that time frame of the spring harvest in the Holy Land, in that area of Jerusalem. Later feasts, of course, the fall festivals are tied to the fall festival season. If the Hebrew calendar needs adjustments, who has the authority to make those adjustments? The answer is clear. The Bible points us to the Jews as the guardians of the oracles of God. And that would include the Hebrew Scriptures and the festival calendar, or the sacred calendar. In your notes, Romans 3, verse 2, Paul writes an answer to the question of what advantage do the Jews have over Gentile nations. His answer to that, Romans 3, verse 2, in your notes, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. They are the keepers, the gatekeepers of the Hebrew Scriptures, of the Old Testament, and the calendar. So God entrusts the Jews with 2/3 of the Bible that we have here, and also to preserve and pass down to people through the ages. Would it not be logical for God to also entrust the Jews with keeping the calendar to determine his holy days? Next in your notes, Matthew 23, verses 2 and 3. Jesus also said that although the Jewish leaders were not personally setting a good example, he would criticize them in strong words that he didn't use with the common people, but he knew that the religious leadership were the ones that were held in high account for the responsibility, for the weight of the decisions they made. They were still entrusted to make these judgments. And Jesus said, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you, observe. That observe and do. He said this to the people in his day. That reference to Moses' seat is a reference, of course, to the Sanhedrin. It was the high court. It was the supreme court of Israel. And it was in full operation. They had 70, sometimes 71 elders, generally 70, priests and elders who functioned as judges. They alone had the authority to make the calendar adjustments as necessary. All available historic evidence tells us the Hebrew calendar rules were developed by the proper authorities who preserved them as part of the calendar that we use today. I mentioned, again, the study paper titled The Hebrew Calendar that Kagwa had produced in 2013, 25 pages. I might have said 29 pages, 25 pages. Here's some comments from it in your notes. The accuracy of the Hebrew calendar, here's an interesting comparison. With imperfections in any calendar, Still, the Hebrew calendar has some amazing accuracies that predate any modern computers and modern tools of astronomy. In the way the Jews revealed their method of calculation, one lunar month, and you can see these figures in your notes, 29.53059 days. That's what the Jews had come up in ancient times without the use of modern technology. Now NASA has the advanced technology and the ability to look at the very precise cycle of the moon to 29.53058 days. So the difference between NASA's figures and that used by Hillel II, now he was a scholar and a patriarch in the 300s AD, 358 AD. Hillel II posted or published this information. It was held secret for centuries. The Jews would only hear about it after the announcement was made by this secret group, probably in the Sanhedrin. But it's only off by 17 milliseconds in the period of 1 month. 17 milliseconds, or 2 millionths of a day, between modern technology and what the ancient Israelites or Jews had come up with. So it's quite remarkable, actually. Let's talk about the first day of Tishri, which we know as Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets. The first day of Tishri is when the molad occurs of the moon. That's the same thing as saying the new moon or the conjunction of the moon. Different terms. If you're in astronomy, it's the conjunction or the new moon. If you're talking about the Bible, it's the molad. Same thing. It's when you look up in the night sky and the moon might be straight overhead, but it's totally dark. You can't see it. Now, some people debate whether or not the Jews searched and watched for the very, very first crescent as the sun was setting, and then you would see in the western sky before the moon set over the horizon, you might see the first crescent on a clear day, but the average person has to wait until they see 5 or 6% of the light. If you have a telescope, you might see 1% of the new light of the crescent. I always love seeing a very, very clear evening and actually looking out the window driving and say, oh, look, there's the first crescent of any month. You don't get to see it all the time. Some months are cloudy and rainy, and you don't get to see them. And so the Jews had a combination, the best of scholarship we have. Historians say they had a combination of people scouting and looking for the first crescent, as well as doing calculations. But it was the Sanhedrin that had to converge or give consensus to, yes, okay, we have enough reports of the first crescent, we can give this a precise day. Often they had to do other calculations. Let's talk about that. The Molad of Tishri marks the beginning of the civil year on the Hebrew calendar. Once again, the sacred year starts in 3 days. It'll be the 1st of Nisan. The civil year among the Jews is the 1st of Tishri, or what we call Feast of Trumpets. This date determines the first and then all the other dates for the holy days in the year. They can do this hundreds of years in advance. They don't even have to wait using calculations. They don't have to wait for observation of the moon. They don't even have to wait till next year. That's why when you get these little cards in the mail over the years that have 5 years of holy days on them, this has been calculated hundreds of years now in advance to when Feast of Trumpets is going to be on the year 2099 or whatever. It's all calculated, and it's kind of convenient when you think about it. They can work backwards now. Once they have determined when this coming Feast of Trumpets is going to be, which they've already calculated, you take 164 days backward and you determine when Passover is, which is coming up on April 5th, the evening of April 4th. We'll be here to observe that. So that works even backwards in a given year. But then it's so easy to map out what the next couple of fall holy days are, and then go back to Passover and unleavened bread and Pentecost. Well, Pentecost, that's an exception. That's counted. This is where the Jews missed the mark. They still look at Pentecost as a calculation, whereas God said count from the Sabbath within the week of unleavened bread. And it can be on the edges of unleavened bread. But you count 50, and it always ends up on a Sunday, always. So this is one deviation where the Jews, and you scratch your head because you say, okay, God gave them the oracles to keep, and they're so precise, and they're so exacting. How did they miss that one? Well, that's up for debate. But when we read the scriptures, that's the only holy day that's not calculated, but counted from the Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread. So anyway, I'm getting a diversion here. All right, in your notes, the molad. Let's read this together. The time from when the moon goes dark, again, the astronomical new moon or conjunction, to when the crescent appears, it can stretch over as much as 3 evenings. In the Hebrew calendar, the molad, which is roughly translated as the birth of the moon, is determined by calculation and not observation, and it is based on the mean length of the full cycle of the moon, precisely 29.53 and some digits after that days. Since this is not an even number of days, again, adjustments to these rules must be applied to arrive at a usable calendar. Next note in your handout, postponements. For much of the time, the actual day of that new moon or molad is used as the first day of the new month, much of the time, but not always. Not always. Sometimes it must be postponed by 1 or even 2 days. Again, we're talking now about that new moon that occurs on Tishri 1, which will be the Feast of Trumpets coming up this September. So anyway, here's an important point. The molad of Tishri and the first day of the month, which is the same thing, do not exist until they're declared by the rules of the calendar. You don't know what the first day of Tishri is until it's been determined by calculation and posted, which it is, again, for hundreds of years from now. You can go online on the internet and find again how many, what is that new moon or Feast of Trumpets many years from now if you want to. The Hebrew calendar, which we believe is the one used in Scripture, requires some rules of calculation. Jesus Christ made no issue with the holy days that he kept all his life on earth. He made no issue. He didn't contest it. The rules that were in place, when Hillel II in 358, whatever it was I mentioned, made this public, it was something that was kept secret. We don't know who came up with these rules, the calculation rules, the 4 postponements. We don't know. But there's enough evidence that shows that they were in effect when Jesus was alive on earth. And so there are these 4 major rules that are followed when determining the day of the 7th month, the first day. The rules are called dihiyat, or in Hebrew, or postponements in English. The rules of postponement play a major role in establishing the first day of Tishri, as I mentioned, which in turn calculates the remaining festivals, even working backward to Passover in a given year. Even if we cannot know the full details of their purpose, they are part of the calendar. Now, at this point, I had a lot more material that I decided to just keep out. You would have been glazed over if I went through all of these 4 postponements and the little details. There are simpler versions, and there's very much more thoroughly explained versions of the same 4 postponements. I decided to leave that out. I'll just say here, the 4 rules of postponement, this is in your handout, that we have today were kept secret by the rabbis for centuries. When the destruction of Jerusalem came in 70 AD, it scattered the Jews into many faraway lands. the Sanhedrin continued to operate outside of Judea. Now, they were banished from Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, the high court. But they continued to operate into the 4th century AD. At that time, the Church of Rome brought them into more persecution, and they had to disband. That's when the chief rabbi and patriarch Hillel II, 359 AD, published what was already being used for centuries. He published it because people were scattered into further faraway places, and they couldn't get the word out in faraway lands as to when was determined when the first day of Tishri was going to be. Now, anywhere the holy days could be calculated hundreds of years in advance, and when these rules were first started is unknown, and we have no evidence that Hillel II actually created them. We have no evidence of that. He just published them. That's what we do know. And then not in your notes, it says 2 of the 4 rules of postponement are about astronomical issues and are important in determining the length of the following year. 1 rule is simply practical. This comes from our study paper. What do you do if the molad, or the new moon, occurs either at noon or after noon? Well, do you say it's the day before or the day after? You postpone it. If the new moon, which comes down to the minute, in fact, this coming Tuesday, March 21st, it'll be 1:22 in the afternoon when the precise new moon occurs. And so it'll be in the middle of the daytime. You couldn't see it, even if it were night, you couldn't see it. But astronomers know that that's precisely the time it will happen, Eastern time, 1:22 this coming Tuesday. So you would have to postpone 1 day if it were in September, Now, there is a postponement coming up. September 14th of this year, the molad will occur at 9:40 in the evening, Eastern time, the new moon. And so the Tishri 1, or trumpets, will be postponed 1 day. And so you'll see on your holy day calendars, it'll say it'll begin at sunset September 15th. But the new moon precisely occurs a day earlier. So there will be a postponement this coming year. You never know it other than just watching your calendar for when does the new moon begin, and you'll say a holy day calendar, well, it looks like it's off a day. Well, the postponements had to do with that. So that was just one example of why you would postpone to the next day, because the new moon might occur just after 12 o'clock noon in September. The rule that gets the most criticism, and perhaps the simplest compared to the others, is the least understood. But that there are no writings that explain the purpose for any of the 4 rules. It's widely speculated that the postponements are simply for convenience. I used to not be very educated in it, even though back in the 60s and 70s, Ambassador College students had to learn in class the 4 postponements. It was part of their assignment or part of their the curriculum. I was reading about this last night, but that was just because they were trying to educate people in the church as to why these are there. Well, I didn't have that class at Ambassador College, or that part of a class, and so years later I finally realized, well, there is some logic to these postponements, or some logic. And here's a note: the Hebrew calendar is a more accurate calendar with the rules of postponement than it is without them. If one uses a 19-year time cycle, now what is a 19-year time cycle in astronomy? It's when the sun, the earth, and the moon are in the exact same place. It takes 19 years before the sun, the earth, and the moon are in the same place again. And that happens every 19 years. So there is a 19-year cycle. It's closer to being exact with the postponements and the intercalary years. Remember, that's a 13th month added 7 times in every 19-year time cycle with the Hebrew calendar than if you left them out. It becomes a more accurate calendar for us. So once the marking of the first day of Tishri, again, Feast of Trumpets, is established, The rest of the holy days fall into place. I mentioned already earlier, once you establish that, you count backwards 164 days to find out when Passover is going to be. Last 2 points in your handout. Do the rules of postponement move the holy days? Some people have argued, well, you're just shifting the holy days around. Is God happy with that? Well, let's read together. Some say you cannot postpone God's holy days, or the Jews have added their own ideas to the calendar for the sake of convenience. It is true that one postponement prevents the Day of Atonement from following immediately before or after a weekly Sabbath. It is clearly more convenient to avoid this happening, but is this the main reason for the rule? We simply don't know. We don't know for sure. Yes, it's convenient not to have atonement after a weekly Sabbath as far as the burden of things that would happen on 2 Sabbaths in a row when you don't have any work. You have one day that you have no work, the next day no servile work. Either way, it could be a burden, but we simply don't know if that was God's intention. In reality, until the Molad, the new moon of Tishri, has been determined, there are no holy day dates set. Criticism that the Hebrew calendar somehow moves the holy days through the rules of postponement really misses the point. This is a quote from our study paper. There is nothing unbiblical about any of the rules of postponement, and it can be shown that they all have an impact on the astronomical calculations and the accuracy of the calendar. And I close with this conclusion here. And I hope I haven't lost all of you with all that data, all that information. Again, it took me hours of looking into this before I started saying, this is actually pretty interesting. But it's easy to gloss over and say, oh, good, leave that for the experts, leave that for the scholars. I don't have to worry about it. I had this little card in my pocket that tells me when the holy days are, and I mark them on my day timer calendar at home, and I'm happy with that too. I'm good with that. I really am. Conclusion. Again, the Molad of Tishri, Feast of Trumpets, the new moon, the first day of the month, they do not exist until declared by the rules of the Hebrew calendar. The rules of postponement play a major role in establishing the first day of Tishri, which in turn is used to calculate the rest of the festivals for that given year. Even if we can't know the full details of their purpose, they are part of the calendar. So that concludes a little bit of information and history on the Hebrew calendar. And at this point,